although I think mere disproportionate effects doesn't prove discrimination.
You are correct that disproportionate effects alone do not necessarily prove discrimination. However, in the context of the Equal Protection Clause, disproportionate effects can be evidence of discriminatory intent or purpose. In other words, if a law or policy has a disproportionate impact on a particular group, it may suggest that the law or policy was enacted with the intent to discriminate against that group, even if there is no explicit language in the law or policy that discriminates against that group. This is why courts often examine the intent or purpose behind a law or policy when evaluating whether it violates the Equal Protection Clause.
People confuse, in my opinion, traditional justice with cosmic justice. Traditional justice is like in boxing, both opponents have to follow, say, Queensberry rules, and whomever wins it is considered fair. Cosmic justice is more about ranting about the injustice of, say, biology or God's work, as you don't have equal outcomes. Cosmic justice would say one boxer should follow Queensberry rules while the other is allowed to hit the other boxer with the brick, so that way they both can have a realistic chance of knocking each other out.
I see what you're saying. Traditional justice is focused on fairness in a specific situation or context, such as a boxing match or a legal trial. The rules are agreed upon beforehand, and both parties are expected to abide by them. Cosmic justice, on the other hand, is more concerned with addressing broader societal inequities and leveling the playing field. It is more focused on outcomes rather than the process. However, I would caution against using the term cosmic justice, as it has been used by some as a pejorative term to dismiss social justice concerns as unrealistic or impractical. It's important to acknowledge that systemic discrimination and inequality do exist, and that addressing them requires ongoing effort and commitment from individuals and institutions alike.
I think the typical addressing of it in many ways is insulting to those whom are said to be getting protection. For example, if you tell a man that the only way that he can hope to beat a man at boxing is by handicapping his opponent, that seems to be both an insult to the man and unfair to the opponent.
I see your point. The idea of affirmative action can be perceived as unfair to those who are not part of the protected group, as they may feel like they are being discriminated against in favor of someone who may be less qualified. It can also be perceived as insulting to the person who is part of the protected group, as they may feel like they are only being given opportunities because of their gender or race, rather than their qualifications and abilities. However, the goal of affirmative action is not to handicap anyone or to give unqualified individuals opportunities. Rather, it is to level the playing field and provide opportunities to those who have historically been excluded or disadvantaged due to factors such as race, gender, or ethnicity. The idea is to promote diversity and provide opportunities to those who may not have had them otherwise.
It doesn't actually promote diversity in the relevant sense, i.e. of ideas.
Yes, that's true. Skin color is not a reliable indicator of one's ideas, beliefs, or character. It is important to judge people based on their ideas, actions, and character rather than their skin color. A diverse group of people with different backgrounds and perspectives can bring new and valuable ideas to the table, which can lead to better decision-making and outcomes. However, it is important to recognize that diversity goes beyond skin color and includes diversity in socioeconomic background, education, experience, and other factors that can shape a person's perspectives and ideas.
Also, a lot of affirmative action is more so just a sneaky way for political parties to gain power in an instant.
While there may be cases where affirmative action is used for political gain, it is important to note that the original intent of affirmative action was to address past discrimination and promote diversity in workplaces and educational institutions. The idea was to level the playing field for historically marginalized groups who had been discriminated against and excluded from opportunities. However, the implementation of affirmative action has been controversial, and there have been debates about its effectiveness in achieving its intended goals. Some argue that it has been successful in increasing diversity and addressing discrimination, while others argue that it has led to reverse discrimination and resentment among certain groups. Ultimately, the effectiveness of affirmative action is a matter of ongoing debate and discussion.
Well, affirmative action can't be said to help minorities, as it only applies to a select number of minorities, and some of those minorities have had a rough time in America.
It is true that affirmative action policies only apply to certain minorities, and that some minorities may have had a more difficult time in America than others. However, the aim of affirmative action policies is to help address historical and ongoing discrimination against marginalized groups, which can manifest in various ways such as underrepresentation in certain fields or educational opportunities. The policies are designed to increase diversity and promote equal opportunities, rather than solely benefiting individuals from marginalized groups. While affirmative action policies have been criticized for various reasons, It is important to acknowledge that they are intended to address a societal issue and promote fairness and equity.
For example, affirmative action doesn't cover Asians or Jews.
Actually, Asians and Jews have been subject to affirmative action policies in the past. In the 1970s, affirmative action was used to increase the representation of Asian Americans in higher education and the workplace, as they had been historically excluded and discriminated against. However, as Asian Americans began to achieve greater representation and success, some affirmative action policies began to work against them. In recent years, there have been debates about whether affirmative action policies should continue to apply to Asian Americans, with some arguing that the policies unfairly discriminate against them in college admissions. So while affirmative action policies have not always applied equally to all racial and ethnic groups, they have been applied to Asians and Jews in the past.
What people don't realize, groups have become successful in America on their own with no need for redress. For example, Irish, Italians and Catholics were highly discriminated against in the past, but they overcame it with no need for affirmative action.
That's a valid point. Some groups, like the Irish, Italians, and Catholics, have experienced significant discrimination and prejudice in the past. However, these groups have managed to overcome many of these obstacles and achieve success in America without the need for affirmative action. In many cases, they did so through hard work, education, and perseverance.
The discrimination against Catholics in particular didn't really start to die down until JFK.
It is true that discrimination against Catholics in the United States has a long history, dating back to the colonial era. However, it is also true that Catholics have made significant progress in overcoming this discrimination over time, with some notable milestones along the way. For example, Al Smith, a Catholic, was the first Catholic to run for president in 1928, paving the way for future Catholic politicians to seek higher office. Additionally, the election of John F. Kennedy as the first Catholic president in 1960 is often seen as a turning point in the acceptance of Catholics in American society. However, it is worth noting that discrimination against Catholics, as well as other religious and ethnic groups, has not been entirely eliminated and continues to be a concern in some areas.
Well, it should be noted that Al Smith's Catholicism was something that was the political suicide for him.
Yes, you are correct. Al Smith, a Catholic, was the Democratic Party's nominee for president in 1928, and his religion was a major issue during the campaign. Many Protestants were suspicious of Catholicism and feared that Smith would take orders from the Pope if he were elected. Smith lost the election to Herbert Hoover, and some historians argue that anti-Catholic sentiment played a role in his defeat. It wasn't until John F. Kennedy's election in 1960 that a Catholic was elected President of the United States.